In just 30 years, the World Wide Web has totally transformed our lives and societies, but the web is about to change again, and that means our lives are going to change with it. In this video, we're going to explore what astrology can tell us about the changes coming to the internet and to how our world is organized. It may not seem obvious that the world of the Mongols or medieval Europe has anything to tell us about the modern world of Midjourney and ChatGPT and TikTok. But it does. The fact of the matter is that today we're standing right on the precipice of an era of decentralization, and that will include a decentralized internet. But it always helps to have an interpreter to help guide us through space and time. And for this episode of World Astrology Report, I'm joined by a special guest. My guest this time is a software developer, astrologer, mystic, artist, and writer. His real name is Wei, but he goes by the internet sobriquet Sadol Sood, the brightest of the bright. And he's working at the cutting edge of technology and esotericism. Who better to help us understand the nature of the times?
So today we're going to talk about the ways in which Pluto in Aquarius points to changes in how information is controlled and shared both by governments, by individuals, and by AIs.
What we're going to do in this video is what we might call visionary speculation. We're going to be imagining the future with astrology, history, and our understanding of the current moment as our guides. And we need to start by situating ourselves in time, in history. And this is where astrology really comes into its own. We're going to focus on two astrological developments which really help us to understand where we are in history. Firstly, the Age of Air and Pluto's imminent 20-year transit through Aquarius, beginning March. Now, the Age of Air is something I've covered in a previous video, which I recommend you watch if you want to get up to speed. I also have an article in the description which explains precisely what we mean when we talk about an Age of Air. But in brief, what it means is that conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn are now taking place in air signs. Now, these conjunctions take place every 20 years, and they were used by traditional astrologers to mark the passing of history. Because of the geometry of the zodiac, they take place in signs of the same element for stretches of roughly 200 years at a time. So we get 200 years of fire conjunctions, then 200 years of earth, then 200 years of air, and finally 200 years of water. And then the cycle repeats. And these elemental ages really tell us something of the nature of the times. They show us how societies are organized and ruled. They tell us about their ethos and about the technologies that are shaping history. And they speak of the kind of calamities that we have to deal with during the epoch. Now, the 19th and 20th centuries were essentially an age of Earth. This was a period characterized by materialism, the era of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of global capitalism and European colonialism, and all these related phenomena which really center around a very materialistic conception of what life is and what's meaningful.
And what did we do with Earth? We consolidated, we mined the Earth, we extracted the resources, we turned the entire world into this kind of capitalist machine engine. It was also very kind of secular, very rational, very materialistic, both in the literal and figurative or metaphysical senses.
But in 2020, we moved fully into an age of air. What seems to happen in air ages is that societies are reorganized to allow the swifter, more widespread flow of ideas and information.
Air is associated traditionally with intellect, with the mind, also with the subtler pieces of reality, so spirit, the sense that there is, the ether literally in the air, like that's a traditional idea associated with the air. So in these airy times, you expect to see the ways in which we do business, the ways in which we socialize, the ways in which we organize our lives to move from a more earthy kind of manner to an airy sort of manner. So earthy systems are, singular, huge governments, big monopolistic corporations. You having a hoard in your house or a cave or whatever, like that's your stash of gold. That's all very earth mentality, right? In an air mentality, we end up in a society where you're able to travel from place to place or occupation to occupation much more easily, where people associate more freely based on their ideas and the personal identifiers of who they are, as opposed to, say the clay that they happen to be made of. The Age of Air in general has many long-reaching implications, but I would expect that things will get faster. Things will be much more simultaneously more diverse, but also homogenized. And the reason I say that is you have diverse individuals with homogenized systems that allow those individuals to interact more widely and broadly.
Now, if you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor and hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. There's more content like this coming your way. Thanks. Let's consider the last age of air, 1186 to 1425. During this period, the Mongols, a nomadic people from the windy steppes of Mongolia who were organized into a kind of decentralized clan structure, managed to build an enormous empire. They took over most of the Eurasian landmass, including China. The Mongols were incredibly interested in the technology and the knowledge of the peoples that they conquered, and they would incorporate it into their fighting force. They quickly became the most technologically advanced civilization on the planet. They would move people around their empire, artisans, engineers. This led to a great exchange of ideas and information and technological development. But the same age of air played out very differently in Europe. Europe was mostly spared invasion by the Mongols, but it was ravaged by plague, the Black Death, in this air period between 1346 and 1353. Plagues were the calamity that traditional astrologers associated with ages of air. Hello, COVID-19. Now, the Black Death killed so many people in Europe that it's generally held to have ended the institution of feudalism. This was a system of social organization in which everyone from the king at the top to the serfs who worked the land were arranged in a kind of rigid hierarchy. The serfs were bonded to the land on which they worked. But because the Black Death killed so many people, this really raised the bargaining power of the serfs. Landlords really needed them, and this meant that working people could move around more, circulate, and find work more where it suited them. So society became more airy and less earthy, and what followed in Europe was the Renaissance. So what about our age of air? Well, the period of 1980 to 2020 was a kind of transitional period when we were moving from the age of Earth to the age of air, a period characterized by both earthy materialism and airy information focus. The age of air began with air conjunctions in Libra in 1980 and 81, but then in 2000 we had one final Earth conjunction in Taurus. And this was an extremely important period in history. During the 20-year period following those first air conjunctions, we had the birth of the World Wide Web. It was conceived by Tim Berners-Lee in 1989 and released to the public in 1993. And the web is the ultimate airy technology. It lets information loose to flow like never before. The early web, the web of the 90s, was much more chaotic and decentralized than the web today. Because what happened after that Earth conjunction in Taurus? Well, the web was taken over by big companies, by Google, Facebook, Amazon. In other words, it was taken over by money, and these companies corralled us all into their walled gardens. In other words, the airy web was earthed.
So one of the fundamental issues with these centralized systems like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter is essentially that they are designed to be what's called sticky in the industry. And a sticky app is one that once you start using it, you can't stop using it because all your data's there, all your friends are there, all the people that you interact with are there. Philosophically, you know, the age of Earth sorts of companies, they don't want you posting anywhere else. Twitter doesn't want you cross-linking to Instagram. Instagram doesn't want you going to Twitter. They want you to stay right where you are so they can monetize your clicks and your eyeballs.
But before we get into the changing nature of the web, we do need to talk about Pluto's coming transit through Aquarius. Pluto will move into Aquarius on March the 23rd of this year, and it'll be in that sign for 2 decades. A simple way to encapsulate the meaning of Pluto in astrology is hidden power. Pluto was a powerful god, the lord of the underworld. In other words, he was a power hidden from view underneath the earth. So Pluto in astrology is about the eruption of hidden forces, the revelation of hidden truths. But Pluto's going into Aquarius, an air sign traditionally ruled by Saturn. And perhaps more than any other sign, Aquarius is the sign of the collective. In the zodiac, it's the sign opposite Leo, the sign of the sun. The sun is symbolic of the center, of the self. So Aquarius is about systems and mental frameworks that sustain the collective. And Pluto moving into this air sign, into Aquarius, is going to supercharge the age of air. Now, if you're wondering what astrology might say about you and your life as we move through these tumultuous times, I'm currently available for private consultations. Details in the description below. Previous Pluto transits through Aquarius, we saw the Reformation, we saw the Copernican Revolution. The last time Pluto was in Aquarius, we saw the American Revolution, which overturned rule by the British, then the most powerful empire in the world. We saw the early phase of the Industrial Revolution, and the French, in their revolution, overturned their monarchy. So we have this theme of the center being overturned and new centers forming in other places.
One really interesting signification of Aquarius is the fringe, right? It's being somebody who kind of sees society from the outside, and in that way they can see the water that all the other fish are in, and they can kind of understand how society is structured through their kind of unique perspective, right? Where when you're directly in society and you're kind of just a cog in the giant machine of culture, you don't necessarily understand how the stuff around you is constructed. You're just part of it. And the interesting thing with Earth conceptualization is that it's all centralized. It's all kind of, you know, like this big mountain, a mound, right? Whereas with air, we're talking about all of these individual currents of air molecules that are everywhere simultaneously. And so as we move into this age of air, I also kind of expect that everything becomes a little bit more fringe, because when there is no center, everything is the fringe, touching everything else at the edges. But at the same time, that also adds, you know, cultural and social challenges where you can no longer appeal to a central authority and say, hey, that person is bad, that person is wrong, they need to, you know, be shut up or not be here or whatever. And instead, you kind of have to deal with it on your own terms. Everybody has to deal with it. And I do feel that it kind of reflects a truth that is bubbling up, which is that over the pandemic and over, I think, just the last 20 years, we have, as individuals, gotten access to the internet and been able to become much more individualized and particular in our interests, and we've all gotten, you know, a lot weirder. And I think that part of the social breakdown we're seeing happening on Twitter and across the internet is a reflection of that, and also reflects the cultural need to create more spaces.
What the astrology seems to suggest is that we're going to move off centralized social networks and onto decentralized networks that can't be controlled by a single entity or extremely rich shitposter. And we're already seeing this happening. So in the same way that Facebook and Twitter changed the world over the past couple of decades, decentralized social is likely to do so again.
To talk about from the user experience, it really is quite similar to any other type of social network. You go to the website, sign up, and then you can just start posting and you can browse a global timeline. The difference is that you have to choose which app you want to use, because there's a bunch of them that all work on the decentralized protocol. So another big important difference too is that if you want to, say, use a totally different protocol, one big part of the decentralized ethos and Web3 ethos is interoperability. So can you interact with another protocol very easily? Can you post from DeSo protocol onto, say, Lenza is another protocol that's being worked on, or Blue Sky.
So what we're likely heading towards is an internet where we carry our identity from one network to another. In other words, we're going to become digital nomads, not in the working from your laptop in Bali sense, but in the sense that in the web, we won't be stuck in Facebook's walled garden anymore. Genghis Khan would be delighted. That was probably a reach. But why would we even move from centralized social? What would drive those changes?
I think that what would really drive a push towards decentralized networks is some sort of, you know, major event where one of them dies. Like, my bet right now is Twitter. You know, who knows what's going to happen with Zuckerberg's investment in the metaverse. I feel like it's entirely possible that, you know, something like Twitter can easily push many people into a new way of thinking, where they're like, that really sucked. I don't want that to happen again. How do I avoid that?
People from across the political spectrum are getting fed up with having the marketplaces of ideas run by single entities that may not have the same political biases and interests that they do. Before Elon Musk came along, the right was complaining about Twitter, and now it's more the left that's complaining about it. Nobody's happy.
I kind of feel like we are in for some sort of black swan event on the horizon in the next 3 to 4 years, with Pluto going into Aquarius and then Uranus also going into Gemini in 2025 or 6, I believe. I do think that there's kind of been this long-term brewing sense of, like, you know, what are these social media companies doing? Are they actually good for individual, like, mental health and things like that, which might actually end up hitting governmental hearings of some kind once we have Pluto go into Aquarius, because it's all about the secrets of what has been done. There are certain types of problems that cannot be solved with our traditional models, like the metaverse, for example. I personally feel that, you know, you cannot solve it in a centralized decentralized way, because there's just too much data and too much information and too much customization that has to happen there. And you actually benefit from a decentralized model with something like the metaverse, where you hop from world to world to world. You have your own distributed, like this is your distributed avatar, and you can go anywhere you want, and you can connect to anybody's server, and you can talk to anybody, and then you can also connect to them and do business exchanges or whatever. Like, I think that's one example of where we'll see a decentralized mode of interaction with other people be necessitated by the experience that no other tech can really provide in that way. And then it becomes kind of a natural conclusion to say, oh, well, I'm decentralized across the metaverse or across all these other things. Like, why doesn't my social do that?
But the changes that are coming are going to go beyond social networks, at least in the sense that we currently understand them. The astrologer Austin Coppock, who inspired some of my research into elemental ages, has pointed out that we should look to how creatures of the air behave to understand behavior in an age of air. Creatures of the air move in swarms and flocks, which gather together for safety. And in the last age of air, broadly the 13th and 14th centuries, a hugely important unit of social organization was the guild. This was a kind of association between traders or artisans that allowed them to pool their resources for safety and manage competition. And what's really interesting is we have equivalents of the medieval guild emerging online today. A lot of us have already partly migrated off public social media spaces and into group chats. But what seems even more significant is the rise of the DAO, the decentralized autonomous organization. DAOs are organizations that harness the power of the blockchain to allow people to come together on the internet for a particular purpose. They operate according to rules that can be defined by code, and their decisions can be voted on by their members. They can even have their own currencies. They can be like a social network and a private enterprise roll into one.
The thing that makes DAOs really unique from traditional kind of fundraising mechanisms is because they're all based on smart contracts and code on the blockchain. They can accept funds automatically. They can disperse funds automatically. For instance, the major example given is all the people pulling their money together to create Constitution DAO, which was an attempt to buy a copy of the original US Constitution, and they raised something like, I think, $20 million or something, and ultimately they were outbid, and the project owners were like, well, it didn't work, so we're just going to give everybody their money back, and they did. And it was kind of a successful example of a DAO going right, where they didn't succeed at their mission, everybody got their money back, they tried, it was a fun time. On a much more advanced example, there's the idea of a biotech DAO or a IP DAO, where you can actually wrap up intellectual property into a DAO, and then the DAO as a group can collectively decide what they're going to do with that intellectual property, whether they're going to open source it, whether they're going to resell it. That is really my expectation, that we'll begin to see these completely individual economies where people are like, I don't have a job, I just work at X DAO, that's my whole deal, or that is my job, I work at this DAO.
And if we take the DAO and we blow it up in scale, we get the network state. This is an idea that Silicon Valley investor Balaji Srinivasan has been promoting. A network state could span the globe, and it could pool its resources to buy physical territory in the world. In other words, this is a DAO on steroids. Now, something that comes up repeatedly in Ages of Air is the idea of the Shibboleth. The Shibboleth is a particular custom or tradition, or often a way of speaking, that can distinguish between one similar looking people and another. Shibboleths often come down to how you pronounce the names for different kinds of food. It comes from the Bible, when two tribes were at war. One tribe, the Ephraimites, surrounded another, the Giladites, and the Ephraimites wanted to kill the Giladites, but they didn't know who they were. So they made their captives pronounce the word Shibboleth, and apparently because of their dialect, they pronounce it more like Sibolet, and thus outed themselves as being the enemy. In other words, Shibboleth is a piece of data that helps me establish that I can trust you. And the need for them comes into play in encounters between peoples who look similar to each other. And here's where things get really interesting, because if you go to the Wikipedia page for Shibboleths and look at some of the examples there, a weirdly large number of them come from medieval Europe during the last Age of Air. Why would that be? I suspect this is because Ages of Air are times when we see more flow and circulation of people, and the question of who you can trust becomes more important. And guess what? Establishing trust on the decentralized web is going to be hugely important. As we become nomads on the internet, we move from network to network. Those networks are going to need ways of distinguishing who we are and whether they can trust us. Because as the cartoon put it, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog or an AI. And this is a deeply Plutonic theme. I'm trying to establish the hidden truth of who you really are.
So if we think about trust in the example of sending somebody some money, right? Let's say that somebody reaches out to you and says, hey, I have a business opportunity for you. I want you to, work on this thing. And then you say, okay, well, there's a lot of money on the line here. I would like this opportunity. How do I know whether or not this person is trustworthy? Right? So what do? You go to their LinkedIn. You see a list of credentials that they've supplied. You look for any mutual connections. You might reach out to somebody. You would Google their name and see everything that's connected there. In a decentralized platform, you're not using LinkedIn. Instead, you might be using a decentralized LinkedIn where anybody who's logged into that site has had, the claims or say, this is my resume info. This is the job I worked at. This is the person I'm connected to. It's all just there in a public manner. Now, the difference is instead of it all being in LinkedIn's website, in LinkedIn's huge centralized database that they sell, it's just there in the blockchain and anybody can access that data.
And here we meet another Plutonic theme: control. A decentralized internet might sound pretty good to you and me, but governments and elites, powerful people, they want to control the information that people consume. And unless you're a libertarian, you may even agree that that's the government's job to an extent. Now, in the age of Earth, control of the flow of information was relatively easy because mass media was centralized. It broadcast from the center outwards. That's what airy technology looked like in the age of Earth. It was hierarchical. The internet and then social media came along and changed that. Suddenly we could all talk to each other. That said, the social media networks were run by big companies which could be influenced by governments. We know that happened. And governments found ways to snoop on the data that we were exchanging and influence the information that was presented on these networks. We saw that in the revelations from Edward Snowden in 2013 on how the NSA was snooping on internet traffic. And we've seen it more recently in the Twitter files investigations into Twitter and how Twitter was influenced by government agencies to censor various kinds of information. So we have the question here of control of information coming up loudly. And this is always a theme of Ages of Air. The elemental nature of the era tells you a lot about the great conflicts of the time. And in Ages of Air, we often see fights about doctrine and ideas. Now, the last Age of Air began with an air conjunction in 1186. In 1184, just 2 years before that, the Catholic Church launched the medieval Inquisition. And it was no coincidence this was also the period of the growth of monastic networks and universities in Europe. These were almost the internet of their time. Inquisitions are attempts to enforce doctrine and suppress heretical sects and other peoples using the tools of bureaucracy and violence. Writing in the book God's Jury on the Inquisition, Cullen Murphy says this: "The ability to sustain a persecution did not appear until the Middle Ages, i.e. the Age of Air. Until then, the tools to stoke and manage those omnipresent embers of hatred did not exist. Once these capabilities do exist, inquisitions become a fact of life." Think about the capabilities that power now has with the internet. The internet has given the authorities unprecedented ability to snoop on what we say and try and influence our speech. And we're seeing this theme playing out across the world, perhaps most notably in China with its social credit system. But not only there. The pandemic period is a pretty good guide for where things might be going. We saw huge fights during this period over the question of disinformation, misinformation, and over the question of who gets to create and disseminate knowledge.
I believe personally that some misinformation is truly misinformation, some misinformation has been mislabeled, and it's also really difficult to figure out what is what in this scenario because it's been strongly politicized. And I do believe that that is wrapped up essentially in a fight for the control of the government. It's highly about voting about who gets to have power next.
What we're seeing today is the division of society into groups with very different assumptions and values. And to put it crudely, there are whole subjects that are impossible to discuss on the political right or the political left. That's quite dangerous if you want to be able to solve your problems. I think the nature of the times of the Age of Air is that information wants to flow freely. Systems that don't allow that are likely to be unstable in this epoch. And a likely driver of decentralization is probably going to be overreach by governments or billionaires.
It's likely during this time that we'll be experiencing a lot of discourse and, you know, cultural conversations around who's allowed to say what, who's allowed to share what information, and what is or isn't appropriate. Now, the flip side of that is that you get the reaction to that Plutonian control of information and ideas. And so that's when you get people working on new technology to try and escape things that are happening around them where they feel like they don't have that control.
One big area that this battle is going to be fought is the central bank digital currency. If central bank digital currencies completely replace cash, this gives governments a kind of financial panopticon. They can, in theory, know about every transaction you make in your life. And that tells them a hell of a lot about who you are and what you're doing. And don't think your data is going to be analyzed by board functionaries. It's going to be analyzed by very powerful artificial intelligence that can build a picture of who you are and every aspect of your life. The operative word is overreach.
I feel like that's part of what leads to the pushback against that attempt at control. And that's when people are like, whoa, 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 like, what is this thing exactly? Maybe we should think about all these other potential solutions.
This brings us to the last theme of this video, AI. We're going to focus here on large language models, LLMs. You may have used some of these tools, ChatGPT, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E 2. They can understand text. Some of them allow you to create images from that text. They're trained on data, which means things that humans have said, have thought, have written. And they are able to distill the sum total of human knowledge on a particular topic. But of course, human beings can say some pretty unpleasant things. LLMs, since they're trained on what we say, can soak those unpleasant things up. So the organizations in charge of these AIs have had to figure out ways to stop them from saying offensive things. And this is where things get a bit tricky, because there are lots of things we probably all agree are hateful and unpleasant. There are other things where one person is likely to have a different view to another. And here we get to the big question: who gets to decide what data can be fed to these AIs? Who gets to decide what they can say?
You know, AI is really interesting because on the one hand, you have all of the world's information, basically. Like, if you've used ChatGPT, you kind of begin to understand it as like a better Google. You know, you can ask it anything and it can tell you almost anything. The thing is, it requires tons of data, right? It basically requires like the entire internet. So you have to load it, all of this information. And then on top of that, because it's owned by OpenAI, a corporation, they also have put limits on what you can do with it. Even though ChatGPT absolutely can be very, very creative and can tell you all kinds of novel, interesting things, ChatGPT itself will often not do that because it says, you know, as a large language model, I am only programmed to do blah, 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 blah. And it's very boring and not super interesting.
But open source AI tools are allowing people to circumvent the restrictions set by AI companies.
DALL-E is a closed source text to image model. OpenAI, same company, said, no, you cannot use DALL-E to generate images of real people. You cannot generate a boob. And Stable Diffusion is basically the exact same thing, except it's open source. What happened with Stable Diffusion is that everybody was able to use Stable Diffusion, and now there's like a dozen competitors to DALL-E, all based on Stable Diffusion, that have wrapped up that open source code. But fundamentally, I think that we're going to see AI become so desired as a powerful common good that more and more and more open source alternatives become available, and they just get integrated into people's society.
So what we may see is that different groups, different networks are going to use different AIs to manage the content that can appear in their domains. And you might start to get an idea here of some of the consequences this could have. If you think your political adversaries are weird now, just wait till years down the line they've been living in communities policed by AIs with completely different values to what you have.
So you may end up in this scenario where there are really big kind of even reality tunnels, you know, entire ideas of what is true and what is proper and correct focused around these AIs. There's this idea of the term of an egregore, which is kind of like a conceptual aggregation of all of the ideas in a culture into an actual force, depending on how literal you like to take it or not. But it's interesting to consider that the AI itself really will be an egregore, this aggregation of all of the cultural dynamics and information that we've generated and believe is relevant. So, you know, like, who knows, to really go off the wall, like maybe in some future we'll have network network states using AI avatars to interact with other network states' AI avatars, you know, because we're like, they know the needs of the nations the best, so let them have at it, you know? Or like, we'll check the work after, or something like that. I don't know.
And if the internet does fragment like this, governments are probably still going to want to know what you're saying. So get ready for spy bots trying to get into your DAO's group chat.
I think it's absolutely possible for there to be an arms race in AI tooling, in information harvesting. I think we're going to see ways in which public data is used that will boggle our minds. You know, there will be correlations being made that we can't even imagine.
And then there's the question of how society at large can function if it balkanizes into decentralized networks further than it already has. Ultimately, we do still all have to live in and share meat space. Can we live together peacefully when we don't share any basic assumptions about the world? And for this reason, I think some people are going to deem decentralization dangerous and try to put a stop to it. I think the fight for and against decentralization is going to be one of the defining themes over the next 2 decades. What we may see is a process of action followed by reaction, just like in the French Revolution. That's all for this episode. Thank you so much to Wei for joining me.
So my Twitter is Sadalsvd, or SADALSVVD. Sadalsvd. I mostly do tweets right now, although you can find personal guides that I've written for free on how to interpret your own natal chart. I have a guide on also how to do astrodice, if that's something you're interested in, and just have a bunch of resources on Twitter and like to talk. So feel free to say hi. I do have a personal vested interest in this decentralized approach, and I believe that it really is the future. And so I am actually working on my own application that will be a decentralized astrology application. The scientific establishment has not ever cared about or listened to astrology for the last 200 years of the age of Earth. I don't expect them to start now. The way we change culture is by giving the tools to culture directly and saying, hey, prove this to yourself, and let's just start talking about it. Because eventually, you know, the scientists who are very stuck in the materialist kind of view will eventually have to start complaining because everybody's talking about astrology. So that's the long-term plan.
Now, I have another video on Pluto and Aquarius, which I made with S.J. Anderson, which gets deep into this theme. We examine some of the historical precedents of previous Pluto and Aquarius transits, and then we think about what these themes can mean when transplanted into our modern sci-fi world. Thanks, and see you next time.